An introduction to Romanticism. What is Romanticism? Romanticism is an attitude or an intellectual orientation that characterized many works of literature, painting, music, architecture, criticism, and historiography in Western civilization from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. Romanticism can be best understood as a reaction against Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, progress, and urbanization. In fact, it is a critique of the Enlightenment and the 18th century rationalism. Romanticism rejected the precepts of order, harmony, and rationality that typified classicism in general and late 18th century neoclassicism in particular. Romanticism changed how millions of people looked at nature, work, education, love, and money. What follows are some of the landmarks in the historical terrain of Romanticism. The Marais, Paris, May 1760. The high priest of Romanticism, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, authored his most notable works during the Enlightenment period. But it would be his influence on the next era of artful thinkers that would earn him the title, the father of Romanticism. In 1760, Rousseau authors his first book, New Eloise. It's a romantic story told in the form of letters. Rousseau's notion was that nature was essentially kindly and good. Rousseau thought that human beings were born naturally good, and they were later corrupted by bad institutions such as governments, schools, cities, and armies that cause injustice, suffering, and social inequality. One of the main themes in the book is the beauties of nature and the simple life as opposed to the corrupt and artificial life of the cities. In 1762, Rousseau writes Emile, or On Education. He advocates a new method of education that would preserve the child's natural goodness. The work is a diatribe against the rational, scientific, planned, restrained, and oppressive world of adults. Rousseau celebrates the child, the original rebel, the one true representative of everything that is pure, good, and uncorrupted. At points, the book also urges mothers to breastfeed their offspring, the first sustained argument for breastfeeding in Western civilization. Brook Street, London, August 1770. In August 1770, a boy walked along St. Pancras churchyard, took no notice of an open grave, and tumbled right into it. While his walking companion pulled him out, joking that he was assisting at the resurrection of genius, the boy replied, "My dear friend, I have been at war with the grave for some time now." 3 days later, this boy with lovely chestnut hair retired for the last time to his attic in Brook Street, drowned some arsenic down his throat after tearing into fragments some poems he had written. He was Thalmus Chatterton, the 17-year-old precocious poet whose poetry we often learn in colleges today, but was rejected and doomed to failure in his own lifetime. This boy, who was fatherless and raised in poverty, was an exceptionally studious child and published mature work at the age of 11. Although he was a genius, his talent went largely unnoticed and he struggled to find patrons. He was concerned with creativity and beauty, while his family kept pushing him to be a lawyer to make ends meet. The young poet was soon shattered and heartbroken and poisoned himself in despair. A cult soon grew around this young poet, whose unusual life and death attracted much interest. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote a monody to him. Wordsworth saw him as a marvelous boy in his poem Resolution and Independence. Shelley gave him a stanza in Adonais. John Keats dedicated Endymion to him. George Crabbe, Lord Byron, Sir Walter Scott, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti showered praises on him. In France, the Romantics hailed his example. Chatterton became a romantic hero, an emblem, an idea that the Romantics held close to their hearts. The image of a sensitive, doomed person, often an artist, struggling, not understood, and rejected by a vile, cruel, and insensitive world. Romanticism borrows from Christianity. A romantic hero is a secularized Christ-like figure, a deeply noble man punished by the cruel world, but who is adored and victorious in the eyes of the few who understand him. Leipzig, Germany, 1774. Werther is often described as a romantic, but strictly speaking, he was a pre-romantic, and he pointedly distanced himself from the literary movement. Well before the Romantic school took shape, Werther had contributed a number of themes and tendencies that came to be identified with Romanticism. In 1774, Werther publishes a quintessential romantic love story, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's a story of a passionate yet doomed love affair between a young poet called Werther and a beautiful, clever woman called Charlotte. Unfortunately for Werther, he falls in love with Charlotte despite knowing beforehand that she is engaged to a man named Albert. Charlotte later marries Albert, and every day in Werther's life becomes a reminder that Charlotte will never be able to requite his love. Overcome by grief, Werther shoots himself dead. Werther wrote the book based on his own youthful love of a woman named Charlotte Buff, who was already engaged to another man. About the book, Werther said in an interview 50 years later, "That was a creation which I, like the pelican, fed with the blood of my own heart." The Sorrows of Young Werther made Werther into a literary celebrity. Napoleon Bonaparte considered it one of the great works of European literature and carried the book with him on his campaign to Egypt. Werther's suicide is not condemned in the book. Instead of dismissing him as a hothead and a lunatic, what happened in Europe was the so-called Werther fever, which caused young men throughout Europe to dress in the clothing style described for Werther in the novel. Just as the writer had intended, the people were on the hero's side, admiring his passionate, even irrational love, which he knew would not come to bear fruit. The book changed how people thought of love. Passionate love, without logic and mundane calculations, in all its fieriness and turbulence, was celebrated. For a romantic, it was right and noble to follow one's heart. The Lake District, England, 1798. The beautiful Lake District had an enduring influence on Wordsworth and Coleridge, two of the major lake poets. In 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge publishes a collection of their poems titled Lyrical Ballads. At a time when most literature was written about kings and queens and nobles, and in a language that was understood by an educated group of people, Wordsworth and Coleridge chose to write about the common man in language that was understood by lower classes. One of the main themes of Lyrical Ballads is a return to original state of nature, in which people led a purer and more innocent existence. Wordsworth voiced his revolt against industrialization through his poetry and urged mankind to stop their destructive activities against nature. Madrid, Spain, 1799. The artist Francisco Goya creates a painting named The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. In the image, an artist, asleep at his drawing table, is besieged by creatures associated with mystery and evil in Spanish folklore. The Sleep of Reason warns us that we should not be governed by reason alone, an idea central to Romanticism's reaction against the Enlightenment doctrine. Vienna, Austria, 1805. The German composer Beethoven performs Symphony No. 3, Sinfonia Eroica, or Heroic Symphony. The Eroica revolutionized music. It dared to break away from the traditional classical style. It was radical and bold. The world had never heard anything like it. One early listener, whom Beethoven treated to a piano rendition, predicted that heaven and earth will tremble when it is performed. Eroica had the romantic daring. It refused to be just another conventional parlor entertainment of the classical era of subtle amusements and cultured applause. It had an unprecedented scale and intensity that was something new. It was the first great romantic symphony. The musical piece is all the more enticing because it combined many more struggles that would inspire a romantic. The Eroica was composed after Beethoven experienced the greatest personal and spiritual crisis of his life. In October 1802, he finally came to terms with being alone and being deaf. He drafted an anguished document combining elements of a suicide note, a last will, and an artistic manifesto. However, he triumphed over all that and continued to work. Beethoven also did a romantic revolt with the symphony. The symphony was originally meant for Napoleon Bonaparte. Beethoven composed the symphony mainly in 1803, but between then and its 1805 premiere, Napoleon named himself a dictator. Beethoven was so enraged that he famously ripped the title page in half and scratched out Napoleon's name so heavily that he tore holes in the paper. Beethoven's symphony came even closer to the romantic ideals when the symphony ultimately embodied the spirit not of any individual hero, but of hero as an abstract idea. Hamburg, Germany, 1818. The French Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich paints what has been considered one of the masterpieces of Romanticism and one of its most representative works, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. In the foreground of the painting is a young man who stands upon the precipice with his back to the viewer. He is wrapped in a dark green overcoat and grips a walking stick in his right hand. His hair caught in the wind, the wanderer gazes out on a landscape covered in thick sea of fog. Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog is a quintessential romantic artwork. A famous art historian notes that the midpoint of the painting rests at the man's chest. The heart is the center of the universe, not the head. A powerful romantic line of thought. Thomas Hall, the American painter, visited the Niagara Falls for the first time in 1829. He painted what he saw in a painting named Distant View of Niagara Falls. The canvas etched out the untamed spirit of the waterfalls against a pristine landscape that had some Native American figures seen from a great distance. Against the vast landscape, man looked lost and puny. This is also a typical romantic attitude. Many romantics do not believe in God, but they believe in the grandeur of nature and search for the emotions one might experience in religion among the vastness and magnificence of nature. Westminster, London, 1847. In 1834, the Houses of Parliament burned down and the government wanted it rebuilt and looked for architects. Charles Barry won the competition and, along with Augustus Pugin, designed the neo-Gothic Palace of Westminster that opened in 1847, a structure lined with towers and spires culminating in the enormous clock lovingly called Big Ben. This was a going back to the medieval era and the Gothic style, a romantic tendency of loving the past. The French poet Baudelaire, in his essay, The Painter of Modern Life, identified a new and unusual character, the flâner. The flâner carried a set of rich associations: the man of leisure, the idler, the urban explorer, the connoisseur of the street. He's a stroller, a passionate wanderer. But he's not seen as wasting time. Baudelaire, in fact, celebrates him. He's a prince as opposed to the wage slaves who rush to their offices of capitalism every single day. The French painter Paul Gauguin was famous for his disgust for European society, which he believed was corrupted by industrialization and modernization. He journeyed to the island of Tahiti in search of a more authentic way of life, connected to nature. There he created paintings like Day of the Gods, which had native women looking relaxed and natural, sometimes without anything on. Gauguin thought that civilization and all its artifice made us sick, a core romantic belief. The Romantic movement gave humanity a fresh perspective and a new attitude. In a world that was growing more and more rational, technological, calculated and restrained, Romanticism showed a freer way with its love of freedom and crude nature, the exotic, the childlike and the naive. Perhaps in a hard-hearted, mechanized world, we still need Romanticism, and perhaps, at some level, we are all in our hearts a romantic.